Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher. And last week we did our top 5 regrets of WoW from Blizzard's point of view, where we looked at things that were actually really, really good features. For the most part, they were really good features that Blizzard brought in, and like, we can't get rid of these now. Despite the fact that it might have potentially a detrimental effect on the rest of the game, they're just too good. We can't get rid of them. And there was actually I was so impressed, honestly, a really level-headed, for the most part, discussion as to why we didn't include LFD and LFR. That seems like such an obvious thing for most people to include on such a list, right? And this discussion was really good. I was totally impressed by it. So I wanted to throw my 2 cents in there. Not really anything to start a flame war or anything like that. These subjects are always like, people don't want to talk about it because they know people are going to come out of the woodwork and be really emotionally invested in it. So I'm hoping we can avoid that, although I'm sure it'll be hard. Let's say that. It'll be hard. It'll be hard. But let's try our best to basically explain why it never even entered my head as something that I think Blizzard regrets including, and hopefully put some context to it, because it's very easy, isn't it, to go like, well, it's shit, I fucking hate it, and there's no discussion behind it. So hopefully I can use this time to actually explain my thought process on it and give some context to how it happened as and when it did occur, because obviously it's not a case of like, I played since vanilla, so I know more than you. That's not the case. It's just that I experienced it as it happened, and I can give some context to it, because I think if you weren't there when it happened, then context gets lost a little bit. So we're going to do it this way, is we'll talk about both of them, but we'll talk about the consequences first, and then we'll talk about the pros, which I believe massively outweigh the consequences. So LFD, a lot of people seem to think Wrath of the Lich King launched with LFD. It didn't. LFD came in ICC. It was actually at the very tail end of the Wrath of the Lich King is when the LFD was brought in. And the LFD system is possibly the most convenient thing ever, right? I mean, it's very hard to think of something more convenient than the LFD system. Flying, I don't even think comes close to the convenience provided by the LFD system. But if you lived in a world before LFD existed, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. But if you've only played the game since LFD, then that convenience is probably just something you've had since forever, and therefore don't realize it. Previous to the LFD system, obviously the only way to get a dungeon group, remember this predates the pre-made group finder, so you can't use that either, was to stand around and negotiate, which is what you were doing. You were negotiating with people for a spot in a dungeon group to get relatively trivial rewards. And that could take upwards of an hour, if not longer, depending on the dungeon, right? It was common from vanilla onwards to spend maybe, depending on what you wanted to do. So if it's something like UBRS, which was like a 10-man is what usual, or 15-man, am I right there? I think 15 for UBRS. That could take 1 or 2 hours to find a group that was balanced, right? Had the right amount of tanks, healers, and DPS that was of a reasonable setup in order to go into UBRS. Who's going to kite Dracasath? Who's going to do this? Who's going to do this? Does anybody have the fucking key to even open the fucking door? Right? This could take hours to sort out. And you were hoping for 1 drop, maybe, a blue drop. That was it. And then through TBC, which got worse because the heroic dungeons certainly were much, 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 much harder. And were generally for raid guilds. Up until sort of mid-TBC. Even for getting a 5-man together was a very difficult process. Now, what this did do, well, let's talk about the consequences first, as I said. So the consequences of the LFD, I believe a lot of people believe that the LFD spawned a lot of bad players. I believe that that's a common consensus amongst many people, is that the LFD created bad players. Not true. In my eyes, anyway. It's obviously, a lot of this is opinion. It's very difficult to put statistical evidence to this. But what I can tell you is that the bad players who appear in your random dungeons were there from day one. Now, if LFD was the creation of the bad players, then they would have been something that developed over time. That wasn't the case. That's not what happened. These players appeared on day one. Now, the thing about LFD, as we talked about in the Legacy of Wrath of the Lich King, is that these players always existed. They absolutely always existed, but they were never exposed to you. Like, you never interacted with them. And a big part of that is because dungeon groups needed to be formed via negotiation, is it pushed people into forming guilds in order to simplify that process and make things much, much, much easier and convenient that way. than other ways. But lots of people got into... There were still cesspool guilds around. They weren't as prevalent, but they were still around. Guilds that weren't doing much, leveling guilds, social guilds, and such like, as they were called then. Well, these players were there, and they were in their millions. And if you're a more casual player, and I want to reiterate here, casual has nothing to do with skill, in my eyes. Casual just means somebody who doesn't play an awful lot. If a dungeon group formation could take upwards of an hour or longer, and you only have an hour or so at night to play the game, because you're working, you're doing school, you've got reports, whatever it might be, then you're just not going to do dungeons. And that was the case for many, many, many players, is they just weren't going to do it. Or they had the time, but they absolutely were not going to stand around in a city for their playtime and negotiate with people who can be completely toxic. We have to go through the inspection process. There was a big thing about, I want to join your group. Fine, come to Orgrimmar, stand in front of me, let me inspect you. Remember, a lot of this was pre-armory. And see what you're all about and maybe have a guess at what's going on. All this kind of stuff was a thing. This is why gear score occurred, right? This was a simplified way of dealing with it. You can see how all these things led to each other, right? You can see how all these things interlinked to form what we have today. Obviously, there was just millions of players who just weren't doing dungeons. And then this new feature came in where, for them, the pros, that was the big consequence. Another consequence, actually, I want to bring up here, is it did lead to the rise of the player who didn't know where the dungeon was. And a problem that became very apparent, and this did develop over time. This was something that came later with people who were just used to the LFD system by this point. Well, when you would die, I remember this being a particular problem in Caldara, which is where the Nexus and Malagos is if the group wiped for whatever reason, they couldn't get back to the dungeon. No matter how hard you would try and direct some people, they simply could not get back. It was just, they were lost. They had no idea where it was. Now, in terms of that one specifically, I believe the Mythic Plus system has done a long way towards correcting that issue. But let's talk about the pros. The first one I want to talk about is possibly a pro and a consequence depending on your perspective. This new system, this new feature was so convenient. So convenient that it led to people literally standing in cities and leveling via the LFD system. And I'm sure many of you have probably taken part in that at least at some point, even if it wasn't for an entire capped character, but certainly led to something like that happening. That is a negative in my eyes. I see that as a negative because you missed out on so much of the world. And it did lead to a lot of people recruiting their friends and saying, we're just gonna stand here and queue for dungeons and we're gonna do fucking Razorfen Kraul 8 times before we unlock the next dungeon. And then we're going to go off to the Sunken Temple and do that 12 times until we can move on to something else. Obviously, with heirlooms and stuff, the numbers change, but that's besides the point. I believe that was a huge negative for a lot of players because their experience of WoW was staring at a city and just fucking doing dungeons. I think that's negative. But a lot of people like to level that way. So for them, that was a pro. Now they could do that without having to find friends or find a group that wanted to smash content together over and over again. Now they could just simply play the way they wanted to, which for them is a big pro. The biggest pro, though, was the moment when we realized as a player base that now we had a system of doing what is considered to be trivial content by many. And I think this is a big point, is trivial content, which we knew we could succeed in, right? Getting a dungeon group was the hard part. Doing the dungeon was the easy part. And that always was the case, traditionally. But now we could go and do other things. We could go and do our dailies. We could go and do whatever. We could go and do anything we fucking wanted to do without having to worry about someone organizing the group, making balanced setups, finding keys, doing all the nonsense that we'd had to put up with for the last 5 years. And we could actually do that and do whatever the hell we wanted and still have a incredibly high success rate in these dungeons. Despite the fact that players maybe, for whatever reason, gain some satisfaction or hatred of bad players being in their dungeons, no matter what you say, dungeons that are done through LFD throughout its history have had an extraordinarily high success rate. In fact, when dungeons pop up that had a low success rate, so Stonecore would be one of them, the Oculus would be one of them, Blizzard tends to intervene and say, well, that's not what we're supposed to be doing here. This is supposed to be pretty easy content to get you some basic starter gear for the most part, and then move on to other more difficult content. You're supposed to be able to complete this with zero communication, people not interrupting, people not doing the things we would expect of you in more difficult content. You're supposed to be able to get through this. And therefore, dungeons, I mean, I'm sure somebody has, but I bet most of you have never failed a random heroic for a long, long time. A long, long time. This level of convenience far outweighs the negatives in my eyes. I do not believe the LFD system spawned bad players for the reasons I've just given out there. And it brought people into the world who could literally not afford the time to do dungeons without trying to set apart almost exclusive time at a weekend to get one dungeon done. Put that into the thought process when you consider the removal of LFD. Is literally like, oh, this weekend I'm going, let me say this to you and see how ridiculous it sounds. This weekend I'm going to set aside a few hours to get Heroic Violet Hold done. Think about that for a moment. It sounds utterly absurd, doesn't it? But that's the world pre-LFD. That is the world pre-LFD. You had to set aside that kind of time in order to get something like a 5-man dungeon done. And that's, I mean, as much as you complain about time gating now, that's one of the biggest time gates that ever existed in the game, is you would have to set apart this time in your life to get something done which may or may not give you some sort of blue item or a low quality epic along those lines. When you consider the alternatives, and this is why the LFD system and various other similar functions exist in most MMOs now that come out, if it has a similar sort of content system to WoW, because it makes total sense. And without it, it would be fucking horrible. It would be absolutely horrible. Not even including like the convenience of jumping on your alt to get a heroic done quickly. Maybe you just want, if you look at it from Legion's perspective, I just want to get the daily AP done. Not many of my friends want to do fucking heroics on like various characters. So I can jump on. I don't have to worry about finding a tank. I don't have to worry about finding a healer. I just press Q. I go and do my fucking Broken Show dailies, or I go and do my other dailies. I go and get my emissary box done at exactly the same time while this counter ticks down, and eventually I'll get into a dungeon as well. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I just, it's not a negative. I never ever will regret the LFD system coming into the game. If people use it in the wrong way, that's a consequence of people themselves. And that using it in the wrong way is entirely subjective in my eyes. That's entirely down to how they want to use it, and whether they have a lesser experience or they regret that experience themselves afterwards. It's not particularly a problem with the system. I don't think so. So let's move on to LFR. Again, a subject many people don't like to cover, especially in my job, like as a YouTuber or as a commenter or whatever you want to say, as an influencer. LFR is a subject that people try and stay away from because the player base reacts so badly, but I'm hoping we can have a good discussion here. The LFR is a little bit more tricky, particularly in Legion. Similar to the LFD system, there were millions of players who literally never got to raid in any way, shape, or form, right? That just never happened. If you had to set aside hours at a time in order to do a 5-man dungeon, like pre-LFD, then imagine the situation where you're trying to get into a raid, right? It's magnified immensely. And this became very apparent during Naxxramas. And I'm talking vanilla Naxxramas. They just didn't have the way of implementing this technology back then. They didn't have a solution for it. But it became very apparent to Blizzard that they were making this grandiose content. They were investing potentially, and I've no doubt, millions of dollars into creating this content, and no fucker was getting to see it. No one was seeing it whatsoever. So obviously at the Dragon Soul, which is when it came in, the LFR system was coming in. And let's talk about the consequences of LFR, because I do believe there are consequences to LFR, and I think it's fair to say that there are negatives. There is no black and white here. There is grey areas for nearly everything in life. And the LFR does have some negatives. The strongest arguments I've heard against LFR, and arguments that I've championed against LFR, and I've made videos on this, despite the fact some people call me a hypocrite, because I am, and I'm going to say it now, I am pro-LFR. And that should be obvious as I didn't include it in the regrets, but it does have some negatives, and negatives that I've covered in the past. Many people remember my apathy video. I stand by that to this day. There's no hypocrisy there. There's grey areas. As much as people want to be like you're one side or the other, it's not the case. There's pros and cons to all things. One of the big consequences to the LFR was that it changed the goalposts. And that's a very big deal. It changed the goalposts for many, many, many players. The goalposts are where are you setting your end goal? Where do you want to get to? Where do you want to get to? And LFR changed the goalpost for millions of players en masse because their goalpost became something that they could do in 40 minutes rather than a long-term goal that they were aiming for, which involved the improvement of self, right, in terms of player skill, improvement of character progression in terms of gear, and in terms of experience, gaining the experience required to achieve what might be the end goal there. So right now it would be Gul'dan, right? And you could say that your end goal for most players might be, if LFR didn't exist, remember this is the world we're talking about here, might be something like Gul'dan Heroic, right? Mythic is the very hardcore of the hardcore, a perspective shared by many, many, many players. So I'm aiming for like Gul'dan Normal or Gul'dan Heroic. But that's not the case for a lot of people. I don't think so. Again, statistically, very hard to back this up, but it's my opinion, is that when LFR came in, that goalpost just reduced, it just smashed down. Because, as I explained in my apathy video, it is extraordinarily difficult to justify raiding to somebody who has done LFR. Extraordinarily. And Legion has made that so much worse to try and do that. How do you take somebody, let's put it in Legion context to the LFR, how do you say to somebody, this system that you can queue for that requires zero communication, zero effort to a point, right? Minimal effort, let's be fair, minimal effort, zero prerequisites, zero consumables, zero long-term requirements, or signing up. As much raiding does, they want you there on a regular basis. That's why you're part of the team, right? You're committing to months of play when you join a raid team. All these things don't exist in the LFR. They just don't exist. And you still potentially, you'll need the dice to be very favorable, but you still potentially can get the absolute best rewards in the game. If we were to try and analyze things from three different points, one is convenience, one is reward, and one is satisfaction. Now, everybody will put more weight into one of these things. Like, I want the most convenience thing, I want the best reward, and I want the most satisfaction. If we were to judge LFR, convenience-wise, it's 10 out of 10. It requires nothing of you other than to press a button. Really, that's it. And you're in. You're done. And the way the system is set up is if you queue for multiple of them, the likelihood is when one ends, you're immediately brought into the next one. That happens regularly. 10 out of 10 convenience. What about reward? Potentially 10 out of 10 as well. You can, with the time forging system, you can get extraordinarily good things. You have a lower chance, sure, but you can get it. It can happen for you. And if it doesn't, no problem. It was super convenient. I can try again next week if I want to. But what about satisfaction? It's got to be a 0, right, for the most part? But I think that's relative. Similar to the reward, it's relative. The satisfaction is 0 for me because I see no challenge there. But for other players, the satisfaction might be reasonably high. Therefore, the LFR system, it looks really fucking swell, right? Really fucking good when you look at that. And then you look at raiding and you say to somebody, what about raiding? What about the convenience? Convenience is obviously lower. And again, this is relative. If you have an extraordinarily large amount of free time, then convenience is actually pretty high because it's not a problem for you to meet any raid requirements. If you are getting older, as many of the WoW player base are, look at myself, it's very inconvenient. It is. I rush to raid after I put my kids to bed. I read stories to my kids. I tuck them in, give them a kiss goodnight, downstairs, raiding. And you're committed to that for a while until the job is done. Until the job is fucking done, you're committed to that shit, right? You're in there until it's done. So convenience for me personally is pretty low on raiding. What about reward? Well, we talked about that recently as well, didn't we? Started a whole honey nest of fucking drama around that, although no one really was able to say anything other than, well, yeah, it's true. The reward's not the best, because with the time forging system, if you can get the best rewards in LFR, and you're doing LFR, normal, heroic, and mythic raiding, then you have way more chances with way better odds of actually getting really good stuff. So the reward isn't that great either, especially as you get higher up in the raiding scene. Well, what about satisfaction? 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10, overcoming that difficult boss and the cheers and joys and all the hardships you go through to get there are totally worth it once you actually win. Very much like a discussion I have with some people regarding puzzles. If you're experienced with puzzles, and I think this is a great way of having an analogy compared to raiding. If your experience with puzzles is that they're confusing and difficult and you're not really solving any, then you probably hate puzzles. But if your experience with puzzles is the horror and the nightmare and the trickiness, and then you succeed and solve the puzzle and you gain that sense of satisfaction once you do it, oh, I get it. I like puzzles now because that reward, that satisfaction is really, really good, right? That satisfaction, that feeling is something that I can't get elsewhere. And that's when it makes sense. Now, you try explaining that to somebody who's used to LFR and all the negatives that do come with it, and it seems like a big obnoxious chore, right? It seems inconceivable that would be worthwhile, especially if we then threw in like an application process and voice comms, which some people hate, and all these kind of things. And then you end up in a scenario where I believe the LFR has a lot of negatives in that context, in that specific word. However, for the vast majority of people, they could probably see that as a pro. It's like, well, I don't have the time to raid regardless. And this convenience factor and reward factor, I'm not asked about the satisfaction. I just want to get some cool shit on my character. And then I want to play other characters and I don't want to be committed to a guild and all this stuff. All great stuff. And I believe there's way more of those players than there are raiders. Let's not forget, again, to put into context, it wasn't as if pre-LFR, the whole player base was raiding. No, that wasn't the case. It was not the case. It was not the case. Although I do believe it killed the motivation to move the goalposts for many players who potentially could have gone on to do some great things and had the satisfaction that I believe is the best thing that you can get out of World of Warcraft, which is why I made my channel in the first place. I believe that is the thing. So that I would consider that a consequence, but I'm sure there are many people who would see that as a pro. Did it make players worse? I think we have to say yes. I think we do have to say yes. If you change the goalposts and the new goalposts for many, many players don't involve learning or self-improvement, and the things we talked about earlier is like if the goalposts were to reach Heroic Gul'dan, then I'd have to go through X, Y, and Z step in order to make that realistically happen. If the goalposts get changed to not require X, Y, and Z step, then that means that the overall sort of skill cap of the majority of the player base lowers. Many people will push past that for sure, but they don't need to, is the point I'm trying to make. That motivation needs to come from within oneself, or maybe listening to someone like me who's like, you should try this because it's really fucking good when it happens. Please try it out. A big thing we did in Legion was getting people into guilds and trying this stuff out. And the feedback from you guys has been extraordinary. It's like, I joined my first raid guilds and I asked those guys to send me emails. Tell me about your experience in a raid guild. Tell me what happened. And overwhelmingly, it's like, oh, I just went through this, didn't like this guy, didn't like that. And then they got through a boss that they were stuck on. We were stuck on Mythic Xavius for a while. How dare I say that? Mythic Scenarios for a while. But then we did it. And it was the fucking best thing I've ever had in WoW. I've done LFR for the last 6 fucking years. But then I killed this boss that we were struggling on. It was fucking awesome and it was amazing. Did you get any loot? No, but it didn't matter because we did it. And that's what I'm talking about. That's the good things that come from it, which I believe, again, is a consequence of LFR, is less and less people are motivated or have any need to do that. And also, I'm sure a consequence of the LFR would have to be said is the players who log in when the LFR is out. You can see it regularly on various forums. It's like, is all the LFR wings out yet? Because they know how the system works. And people are like, no, it's out next week. Okay. And they resub. They clear the content. I killed Gul'dan. I can unsub again. I'm sure there are many players who are in that boat. Again, another consequence. But what about the pros? What about the pros? We're talking about the people who have the potential to reach the heights that I just talked about. A lot of people don't. A lot of people who've played this game for 10 years and are still really bad at it, right? That's fair to say. I know them personally, and they're fine with it. They're not asked about it. It's like, I'm just not great at the game. I get it. For those guys, and I believe there are potentially at this point millions of those players, it's the best thing ever. It's the best thing ever. It's absolutely incredible. It solves all their problems. They're not judged. They're not attacked. It suits their standards. Even if we're not talking about bad players, if we're talking about players who just don't have the time anymore and they want to see the raids and they accept, these old school players who accept that I just can't raid anymore, fine. They can still see this content in one form or another, as in its tourist mode, as Blizzard has endorsed. That's not a negative that I'm spouting, by the way. That's a Blizzard endorsed phrase. It's wonderful for them. It's wonderful for them. All these players, of which there are way many, have a wonderful time. And again, we come down to whether you want to jump on an alt and try out a raid boss. I just want to test out some I want to kill a raid boss. I don't want to organize an organized raid like we would do pre-LFD. in order to do this. I can jump in an LFR, I could try it out. I can get extra chance at Legos to try it out. I can do all these kinds of things in the LFR system. I could try and just squash bosses. I could try silly builds that I can't do in raids. I could do all sorts of wonky stuff. I could try specs that I don't often play and try and work it out. All this convenience far outweighs, in my eyes, the potential negatives. Because those players, I believe it's fine for the most part. I do believe it's fine that every player gets to see the raid content. I've always been a big advocate that LFR should be staggered by one raid tier. I think that's an agreeable solution. In my eyes, I think that's fine. As many players will shit on me for that and actually get so much rage if LFR doesn't come out almost immediately. We saw that recently with the gating of the LFR wings, as people were just like, why? Fuck this. It's out. I want to get in there. I get that as well. But for me, if you're not raiding or anything, if you're not actively participating in the raid scene, then there's no real justifiable reason to see the latest content the moment it comes out. I don't think so, in my eyes. I think in order to regain this, remember the consequence I talked about LFR was the motivation and stuff like that. And I'd like to get some of that motivation back. I'd like to see more fresh blood coming into the raid scene. Difficult at the moment, as Mythic is not the best place to be. But I would like that motivation to be there. And I think staggering it by one raid tier could potentially do that. Potentially. I think that'd be an adequate solution to both ends. Is, well, you're not raiding. You don't need to see it. As long as the gear levels stay the same, if that's what you're after is the item level, the item level would be exactly the same in the previous raid tier as you would get as if it was the current raid. So right now, people would be doing Nighthold, etc., etc. When Tomb comes out, the Nighthold LFR is released. When Nighthold comes out, the other LFRs would be out there, the Emerald Nightmare and all that kind of stuff. I think that's fine in my eyes, but I know that's that's a subjective situation where people would fight tooth and nail as have previously. So there's my thoughts on it, guys. Love to hear yours. Hopefully we won't get just super rage on this one. We'll see what happens. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.